And
I want to make an announcement before you start.
oh yes, Wolfgang.
This is collection day. The few of you that don't know what our group consists of occasionally need a reminder that we split in three. One are the sugar daddies, of whom we have quite a few. Two are the ordinary people who understand that we pay about $5 a person a month for $100 to the church. The third group, which is also quite hefty, are the good-for-nothing hangers-on, or as we call them affectionately, the wingnuts. So please give what you can. The hat will be passed.
Good. You might wait a little bit later when more people are here to pass it,
Sure.
because otherwise there'll be somebody here that will miss them. So. Good.
Go where the yield is highest, right?
Yep. Pardon?
I said, you go where the yield is highest.
Give them a try.
You know, it's like, you don't harvest before there's enough there.
The finer points of hat passing.
Anyway, so we're going to start today's talk, and I have invited, and she has accepted this, is obviously Jodi Frediani, and Jodi is the director of the Central Coast Forest Watch. She is a forestry consultant for the Santa Cruz group of Ventana chapter of Sierra Club.
Actually, for the Loma Prieta chapter.
Loma Prieta chapter, that's close. And she also belongs to a, I love the name of this group, it's called NAIL, N-A-I-L. That's Neighbors Against Irresponsible Logging. Is that
Yeah.
right? You admit to that.
Yeah, they're kind of dormant at the moment since they were highly successful.
Great name though, great name. And anyway, so what Jodi obviously specializes in is the environment, more particularly our Central Coast environment and trees, forestry practices in general.
Yes.
And that's what she's going to talk about today.
Okay. Can you give me a little focus? Because I could talk about just about anything.
Talk about CEMEX and what's happening at CEMEX in Davenport for starters.
Okay, so CEMEX has, well, go back. It used to be Lone Star, then it was RMC, Lone Star, then it was CEMEX. CEMEX was a Mexican-based multinational cement corporation. They own close to 8,000 acres and due, I believe, largely to the economy, although they wanted us to believe that it had to do with the Environmental Protection Agency and the problems that they were putting into the community of mercury pollution and hexavalent chromium. Remember, that's what Aaron Brockovich. Yeah. Well, that was actually Aaron Brockovich. But at any rate, so they shut down the cement plant, and Semper Virens Fund and the Peninsula Open Space Trust purchased the property, and the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County and Save the Redwoods League are involved in some funding and the long-term management. And as far as I know at this point, the land trusts have hired a consultant who is coming up with a management plan. They did hold one community meeting in Davenport, and at the school there it was packed, and kind of had a working group where people all shared what they hoped to see in the long-term management of the property, whether it was bike trails or no bike trails, or logging or no logging, or concerns about how it would impact the Davenport community, to the fish, to the old growth trees. So that's what the consultants are working on right now. And that's CEMEX.
What about the drinking water in Davenport?
The cement plant has a new owner.
The cement plant and that piece of property was not a part of that acquisition. And correct me, but did Joe Ben Beavert actually purchase that? So he did, and I do not know the status of his plans. You might know that, but I don't. So.
Well, needless to say, there's an enormous possibility because it's a lot of building.
Yes.
It's like something like 150,000 square feet.
I mean, it's a fascinating building. I've been on a, had an opportunity to go on a tour of the cement plant while it was still in operation. But, most of what I do, I mean, I can give a little background, and then I'm open to questions and going in the direction that people are most interested in. But I got involved, well, like many people, I came to Santa Cruz to go to the university. My second year in school, which was the second year that the university was open, I'd gone to UC Davis the first year. It was like, I'm going to go to Davis, am I going to go to Santa Cruz? I went to Davis and went, that was a big mistake. And so I transferred here, and I've been here ever since. In 1970, purchased property in Bonnie Doon with my now ex-husband. And in 1980, the property next door, 50 acres next door, 30 acres of old growth redwoods, 20 acres with a house on it, was purchased by a rather disreputable, the attorneys for a rather disreputable development corporation that had been doing logging in the county and making a terrible mess of things. So they had done that. They actually did that throughout the 80s, where they would buy property under a limited partnership, log it, log trees over the property line, knowing they might get caught, but they'd use them as collateral at the mill instead, until they got caught, and the roads would fall apart, the log landings would fall apart, then they would default on the property, they would file bankruptcy on the limited partnership, and then they would open up a new one. So their attorneys bought this property next to me, and they immediately proposed to log 30 acres of old growth redwoods, which is next to the spring that serves my property and 4 other neighbors. And I knew that property line had never been surveyed, and we had old growth redwoods by our spring, and so I was quite concerned that they might take the wrong trees and they might damage our spring. And that was my first sort of foray into the local political scene, and at that time the county was in charge of issuing logging permits. Now it's the state. And so I believe I went to either the Planning Commission or the Board of Supervisors, the county forester. The county had a forester at that time, and he was so upset with these folks that he recommended denial. And I went to Save the Redwoods League, and I said, hey, you got to buy this piece of property, and they did. They bought 30 acres. The logger for that company has been my next door neighbor ever since. That's a long story. I'm not going to go into that. So that's how
That's called Battle Mountain.
Pardon me?
That's why it's called Battle Mountain.
So, and over time, I got involved. My education was in a somewhat different direction, but I started getting involved in the redwood forest and logging projects and the streams and the water. I mean, in Santa Cruz, all of our water comes from within the county, our own forested watersheds. The city gets its water out of Santa Cruz River, out of Majors Creek, which is my sort of front yard, out of Laguna Creek, which is Jim's front yard, out of some springs on the north coast, and the San Lorenzo Water District gets its water up. So everybody in the so-called water district gets its water from within the county, and how we protect that and how we don't protect that has ramifications for all of us locally, but also for the fish that live or are trying to live in our streams and are having a really hard time. So over time I got very involved, and my focus has largely been to try and protect the remaining old growth redwoods, because we're not going to get any new ones anytime soon, and to protect what's called the riparian area adjacent to the streams, and try and help protect the fish in the water. And so it's been a long journey.
So that parcel next to you, what was it zoned for?
What was
It's zoned for?
the property next door to me?
Yeah, you said it was effectively ripe for development. And so was it zoned for 2.5 acres or for?
I said, I'm sorry, my hearing's really bad, and so
You described a property next to you that previously had a potential developer.
No, the company that bought it was called Coast Counties Development Corporation. But what they did was log.
Okay,
They didn't actually do development. They did logging, I think, with the eye. I don't know what they thought, but that's what they were called. They did logging operations throughout the county, very unethical ones, and then they would let the property go back to the people they purchased it from. So they never really seemed to have an intention of developing it. And as for the zoning, that's all complicated. It's in what's called a least disturbed watershed because of the city water supply. And while the zoning might have been 2.5 acres, the minimum parcel size for least disturbed watershed is 40 acres. So but somehow they were able to split
What
it
year,
into
what
two
year was
pieces.
that?
Around 1980, 1983.
Okay, minimum proper parcel sizes in Bonnie Doon at that time was 5 acres. Anything along the coast, I worked on the general plan for Bonnie Doon at that time, before that, and it was 100 acres along the coast. And depending on where you were, but at the minimum they could have broken it down into was 5 acre parcels.
That might be, except that I remember
They were-
that the parcels, that what the general plan said for my property was 2.5 acres. Now, maybe that was a little bit later on, but we couldn't actually split it to 2.5 acres.
Yeah, because because that was one of the things that we really thought about a lot in the early 70s, was about keeping a 5 acre minimum for new parcels. It may have already been subdivided, if it had already had.
Yeah.
So
no,
anyhow, but it doesn't matter. Those
Right.
are details that are.
Right. So, over time, I've been involved, it kind of, the focus has shifted, but I've done a lot of reviewing timber harvest plans, because as I said, back in the early 80s, the county had control, and then that was shifted and taken away from the counties and given to the state, in large part because Santa Clara County was going to, there was a very contentious timber harvest plan over up on the summit in Santa Clara County. Neighbors were all upset, and the county said, well, what do we need logging for anyways? I mean, we don't have that much forest land. And they were gonna just say no logging allowed. And our local mill decided that wasn't a very good plan, went to the legislature, and the legislature redrafted the whole thing and gave the authority to regulate how logging takes place to CAL FIRE, which was called California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection back then. So it's been a bit of a struggle over the years, where the counties wanted this and the states wanted that, and the community has certain concerns. In this area, the logging clear cutting is not allowed, and I learned that was because in the mid-70s, when the state created a new Forest Practice Act. It's called the Zeeberg Nedgley Forest Practice Act. There must have been a couple of legislators. The Stanford professors decided they didn't want to look out of their living room windows and see clear cutting. So somehow they managed to get clear cutting banned for this area: Santa Cruz, Santa Clara, San Mateo, San Benito counties. But I get contacted by neighbors and neighborhood groups all the time who are concerned about their roads, they're concerned about their water supply, they're concerned about their view shed, even though it's not clear cut. They're concerned about their property lines, and the trees are going to be cut on their side or the other. And you mentioned nail. That was a very interesting scenario where I'm sure most of you know where Lexington Reservoir is. Well, that reservoir, basically, the San Andreas Fault comes down along Los Gatos Creek, which flows into the reservoir, and which would be a continuation of Los Gatos Creek, except they built the dam there. And San Jose Water Company, which is a private water company, it's that they forget how it is. I believe they sell water to Santa Clara Valley Water District. But anyways, they wanted to get a forever timber harvest plan, which is called a non-industrial timber management plan. And most timber harvest plans are good for, say, a maximum of 5 years. Although there is a bill right now that the governor's putting forward to try and up that to 7 years, or 5 years with 2 extensions. But there's this other vehicle, this unwieldy term, non-industrial timber management plan, and that's good forever. So once it goes through the review process, that's it. There's no more review, the public can't say anything, the agencies can't get involved. And when the property owner wants to log, they submit a notice to CAL FIRE and go ahead and do it. So the water district wanted to do a 1,000-acre plan, 6 miles long, along Lexington Reservoir, because they owned basically the watershed stuff. You had 1,000 people living up on the ridgetop, all just off of Summit Road. And these are, Silicon Valley folks who did not want to have continuous logging helicopters, log trucks on their roads. They had concerns about fire, even though the plan was being promoted as a way of protecting them from fire. These folks had lived through the Lexington fire and realized the reason their houses were still there is because that fire roared through the chaparral, it got to the redwoods and it slowed down. And it was the large redwoods that actually slowed the spread of the fire. So the last thing they wanted was to see those trees cut. They also were concerned, one of the communities there, Chimiquita, gets its water out of Los Gatos Creek. They were concerned about the water quality, the folks concerned about quality of life, etc. So in order to get one of these long-term forever plans, the property owner can only own 2,500 acres of timberland. Although right now, there's another bill in the legislature that's trying to up that to 15,000 acres. So we did some research and realized that this water company, San Jose Water, owned 7,000 acres. Seemed likely that more than 2,500 acres of it was timberland. Well, how are we going to figure that out? Because CAL FIRE doesn't require them to actually document in any way, shape, or form how much they own. So one of the people involved works at Google, and she had developed Google Earth's environmental program. And she was able to get the parcel data from Santa Clara County and import that into Google Earth. So now we had this overlay. I've got friends who have a helicopter and had worked out a system. I don't know if anybody knows there's a website called californiacoastline.org. Okay, so you can see the whole, except for maybe the military bases, the whole coast of California photographed at 500 foot elevation just offshore, which is why Barbara Streisand sued them, because she claimed it was an invasion of privacy, and she lost. And because of her suit, far more people went to the website to see what her house looked like. At any rate, those folks who created that website live in this area, and they worked it out so the camera is directly connected to the computer, to the laptop with GPS in it. And I realized that the only way we were going to figure out how much land they owned was to simply prove it. So I developed a scheme, brought together my team, we went up in the helicopter, we had the maps, we flew over all of the land, photographing high-resolution, low-altitude photographs. Then we got this wonderful UC doctoral student, and she took all those photographs. Well, they were imported into Google Earth, and she and her boyfriend rotated them all so they were the same whatever you call it, the orientation as Google. And then we would look at those photographs and say conifer, 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 and look at the photographs, and then look at the same landscape in Google Earth and then draw a line or a polygon around it. And then take GIS software and calculate the amount of acreage. And this young student young woman, did a phenomenal job. She showed the smallest amount around the conifer trees, then she did things like seed dispersal and came out. At any rate, created a whole website with this information and showed that they owned more than 2,500 acres. And CAL FIRE, of course, went to the forester who was doing this and said, well, you come up with your calculation. And they did what we called the chicken pox defense, where they drew circles around individual trees and excluded 15 feet between trees. It doesn't really count. And then CAL FIRE went up in a helicopter, and ultimately, for several years, with lots of other stuff going on, with various agencies chiming in, it was determined that they owned more than 2,500 acres and didn't qualify for one of these things. So, the difficulty is there were lots of reasons why that logging would not have been a good idea. I mean, given the San Andreas Fault, the trees leaning over, serious landslide issues below all these homes. But the way the rules and the law tends to work is it's usually a technicality that ends up being the deciding factor. So that was probably the most, that and worked on Gray Whale Ranch back when it used to belong to the Cowell Foundation. Then it was purchased by a man named Chop Keenan, who actually went to school with Gary Patton. But I believe the lion's share of that ownership was Travelers Insurance, and they were going to put a Pasatiempo West out on that property. And in the meantime, they were logging different sections of it. And, I was asked to help fight that, so we stopped some, we didn't stop all of them. The community came together, went, wait a minute, this needs to be a park. And ultimately, through an 8-year struggle, it became a park.
What's the name of the park?
Well, it's Gray Whale Ranch. It's part of Wilder Ranch State Park. It's the eastern portion, I guess. Now I'm actually working with folks over in the Sierra to try and stop clear cutting, which I will just say, because I don't know how many folks here know, I run into very educated people all the time who have no idea that clear cutting in a grand scale is still very acceptable and allowed in most parts of the state. Sierra Pacific Industries, well, it's a family business owned by a man named Red Emerson, who's in the Fortune 500, owns close to 2 million acres throughout the whole Sierra Nevada range, and is systematically clear cutting it.
Oh, God.
And we've never had, certainly not in this country, an ecosystem-wide alteration like that. I don't think that's what the rules originally intended, but the political will is not there to stop this. And even with our so-called green Governor Jerry Brown, I've heard rumors that he has that he and his wife honeymooned in Red Emerson's cabin up in the Sierra Nevada. Certainly what we've seen over the years is the big timber companies managed to get their people in the administration. They managed to throw lots of money. The governor has this tax initiative on the ballot that's probably not going anywhere after the state park funding debacle, but SPI threw money at that. Timber company, I think from the North Coast, also threw money at it. So it's politically it's very difficult because of all the money that changes hands on these things. But I've been working with a broad coalition trying to figure out one way or another to see if we can't start to make some inroads. It's quite amazing when you go out there and you just see this shift, clear cutting plantations. I actually saw some photographs the other day of it's called a burn pile. So they cut the trees and then you've got all the branches and things and that nobody wants, and I think very often they rip the stumps out and they put that into a big burn pile. This photograph, it was probably half the size of this room, as tall as the room and this size. And apparently there are no rules to prohibit a burn pile that size. They are supposed to wait until a certain season to actually light it on fire, but I mean, if a fire comes through, which they do, and they will more and more, you've got this great, Burning Man kind of a thing, waiting to go up and toss its embers, they can go a mile or more. They use massive herbicides, it's watershed for the community of Oakland, for East Bay Mud. So it's from our perspective, it's a huge mistake to allow that to continue to happen. And what they do is they don't just leave the earth bare, they plant it. But now you have plantations of single crops that become very dense, and if a fire hits those just go up into
Or
flames.
disease.
Pardon?
It sets it up for disease also when you get monoculture trees.
Yes, yes, yeah, there are all kinds of reasons why it's not a good, you know, it's, put it this way, you can get away with it for a while, but in the long run, it's liable to, you know, come back and bite you pretty hard. I mean, it's not good for climate, you know, global warming, it's just not good for a whole lot of things. I've seen some stuff up there where, you know, they just ignore the riparian areas, or not even ignore, that would probably be better. But, you know, build a fire, a burn pile on top of it and burn it, and then take a, you know, equipment, and what they do is they rip the soil, so they run ridges through it, so when the water comes down, it doesn't just take, it's kind of like, you know, moguls on a ski slope, so the water doesn't just run and take all the soil down into the lower portions of the creek. So that's a project that, you know, a thankless project that I've been working on.
I
Yes?
have a question. One of the things that is sort of percolating is the oil shale in Monterey County. And I believe it's Monterey Shale is formation is what they're talking about, is where the oil is. That's a significant part of the eastern side of Ben Lomond Mountain. That's what's there, because that's what slid in the earthquake. And I know that there are asphalt deposits, which indicates oil off of Back Ranch Road, because that was where the paving material for the city of San Francisco came. Is anybody sort of paying attention to that, or am I just a little bit early paranoid?
You know, my road, which is in the Majors Creek watershed, or the other side, I mean, Back Ranch Road is on that side, and on the other side, also has an old, it's called an asphalt quarry, which was black bituminous sandstone, which is otherwise known as tar sands, which is a little bit different than the, you know, this shale stuff, which is fracking, which is going for oil, but the tar sands is what's going on up in Canada, where the Keystone, they want to run the Keystone pipeline through the States. I have no idea what it would take to try and do that. I have talked to people who think that the amount of the tar sands here is so small that it wouldn't be economically feasible, and I hope they're right. I can imagine, given, you know, I say I got involved with this logging stuff in 1980, but when I came here to go to school in the late 60s, or mid 60s, Wilder Ranch was going to be a development with 25,000 homes on the north, right there on the north coast. And I was just, you know, like wet behind the ears and got involved with that and kind of tagged along. I mean, I should say I grew up in a very political family, so I cut my teeth, you know, when I was 14 in civil rights marches. But you know, that was what was going to happen on Wilder Ranch. We stopped that. Before that, there was going to be a nuclear power plant in Davenport. The community stopped that. You know, Santa Cruz, for all the things that have changed over the years and the traffic and the different political climate, I think there's still a lot of people here who really don't want to see tar sand exploration. I hope that's the case, you know, if it comes up. But
In Monterey County.
yes.
Are you finished? with your-
Well, I mean, I can go on, but I will entertain questions for.
I don't want to divert you, but if I'm
No,
not
because
diverting you,
Speak spots.
I've seen how things get done in Washington, like at the White House, and from an EPA or the Interior Department Secretary saying, let's do this, or him or she being informed, and that can happen both directions. It can happen with a local group, and I'm astonished and disappointed that Santa Cruz County, the County Board of Supervisors, and the city have not been more effective at being a focal point demonstrator, as you've done, and I compliment your work highly. But it hasn't been in the national dialogue, it hasn't been advertised, it hasn't been promoted by the county as an example of we are out in the forefront, being ecologically ethical as a community and as citizens. And number one, I'm disappointed that your efforts and successes, as you described, aren't more advertised by the county and its political leaders. And I know how ineffective our congressman is. I've watched him in person. But more importantly, what would you like people to do that push appreciation for? Because is it possible in 20 years, 25 years, we'll lose out the gains you've made and fail to achieve other environmental victories for the community, the region, and the planet, my dear? Why aren't we more effective as a county?
That's a big
at demonstrating
question.
this?
Well, you know, in my experience, we used to be. And I mean, that's a broad question, and I can really, I mean, my area of expertise largely has to do with logging. And, you know, the question you posed is much bigger than that. But I feel like I kind of, you know, grew up in a very sheltered environment. We had Gary Patton as our supervisor for 20 years. We had Marty Wormhout as, in my district, we had Marty Wormhout as the supervisor for 20 years. And they both had a really, I think, a strong understanding of the environment and the importance of it to us as humans, as well as to the rest of the, you know, species on the planet. And I, you know, we have a lot of people in the community who worked hard to, you know, I mean, there were other folks who worked who really took the lead on Wilder Ranch, who took the lead on, you know, many of the other issues that have come up over time. I just feel like that political climate has changed a lot. When it comes to logging, the county has limited authority because that it was given to the state. And the county has done things over time where we changed zoning because the community rose up over that. And what happened was, I think that's what sort of set it off, is there was a timber harvest plan up in Boulder Creek, Ben Loma, Boulder Creek area, kind of up by Bonnie Dune, at the top of the mountain up there. And the property was landlocked. And they could get in with a, you know, like a pickup truck, but they couldn't haul logs out of the road. So they decided they were going to helicopter the logs off that property over people's backyards to a site over there, another piece of property. And, you know, people said, you can't fly logs over my you know, kids playing in the backyard. That's insane. And there were some helicopter operations in, you know, the San Lorenzo Valley, and I mean, it's like a little echo chamber there. And so people were going, wait, we can't even think straight having these helicopters flying around. Why is this acceptable? So there was actually, I would say in 1985, the county, I'm gonna back up, and it's not quite sort of an answer to your question, but just a piece of the answer. In the 70s, when these new rules, logging rules were developed, there was a little special piece there that allowed counties to request special rules for their county. And so the counties in the southern sub-district area, Santa Cruz, Santa Clara, San Mateo, San Benito, asked for special rules, and they got some in the first round. In '85, our county decided that they should do that again, and put together a task force, half industry, half, you know, community members, and said, come up with a set of rules that you can all agree on. So I was one of the members on that. And because we were tasked with all agreeing on them, we came up with some pretty benign things like putting a gate across a log road so people wouldn't go in there with their motorcycles and tear the road up. I don't remember what the rest were. All I know is that I had young kids at the time and was probably naive, thought I'd done my job. I learned later on that when these rules went up to the Board of Forestry, who had to approve them in Sacramento, the timber folks followed them up and they lobbied against them, and so the board rejected all those rules. In '95, when we had this other problem going on, and the community said, we want you to the county, we want you to change the zoning, change where logging can take place according to zoning. And so Jeff Almquist at the time, who was sort of the swing supervisor, said, well, let's set up a task force and see if we can find another way to resolve this. So I was on that task force, and that went on for well over a year. We came up with another set of rules. And then my friends and I followed the Board of Forestry. That was in the heyday where they would meet in Tahoe and San Diego, and now they always meet in Sacramento. And we went from place to place, and we lobbied for these rules. We got some of them, we didn't get some of the others. So I mean, the county was trying, and then when that didn't work, they said, okay, From now on, you can only log in these zone districts, the TP, Timber Preserve Zone District, mining, some parks district, and commercial ag, and that's it. Well, that sent the local timber industry into a huge tizzy, and they filed a lawsuit against the county, and that went on for a number of years. And it was actually a preceding lawsuit similar to San Mateo County. In the end, the court said that counties did have the right to determine what, they could use their zoning for determining what actually took place, but they couldn't regulate how logging took place, they could only regulate where. So the county has, over time, made efforts based on community concerns and involvement. You know, there was another one where they changed the minimum size, parcel size to rezone to TP. Again, because the issue here is we've got this very urbanized forest. So, you know, it would be like having, I don't know, pick an industrial activity. I mean,
Oil refinery.
what's that?
Putting an oil refinery in the middle.
Yeah, an
of
oil refinery in your backyard, you know? And I mean, there are some parts of the country where you can do that.
I could,
But most people here wouldn't stand for that for a moment, and yet, you know, it's considered appropriate to have, you know, industrial logging going on. Granted, you know, it doesn't, once it starts, it doesn't go on indefinitely. It goes on, and then there's a break for, you know, 10 or 15 years, and then they come back again. But it still is a conflict situation in the community. So the county raised the minimum parcel size from 5 acres to rezone to TP to 40, I think they raised it to 40 acres.
20?
So, you know, the county's done that. As far as what we can do now, vote for the right supervisors.
Get the right supervisor, or people to run for supervisor.
Get the right people to run for supervisor.
Where are
Vote for
they?
them, for city council members, vote for them.
and show up at meetings. That was the first thing I learned in Bonnie Doon was that you went to coffee, you talked about it, then you went down and you disagreed with your neighbors in front of the Board of Supervisors.
Oh, that's so much fun.
And it was great. I mean, it was just, you know, but it was nobody, I think that Bonnie Doon is probably, I don't know how many people live there now, but it was the size of the city of San Francisco, and I think there were slightly around 2,000 people total.
Yeah.
And, but the involvement level was so incredible. It was coming from Chicago with rampant apathy. It was just refreshing, you know, that everybody stood up and had said their piece. It was like a New England town meeting.
Yeah.
And they would hassle things out, and it was until they would come to some kind of a solution. Sometimes it was as you just stopped talking to some people, but it was wonderful looking at the kind of power a lot that people like you, that it wasn't just simply having an opinion and yelling and screaming, but getting in and looking at things and taking them apart and working with the details of things and coming back to it and hassling it. It's, you know, it's hard run work, and I've really appreciated what you've done over time and being knowledgeable about it.
Well, they're becoming knowledgeable, and I mean,
Yeah.
you know, for many years I chaired, actually for 20 years, I chaired Sierra Club's, Santa Cruz Group's Forestry Task Force, and throughout the 90s, I'll get your question in a second, throughout the 90s we had a lot of logging going on in the Santa Cruz Mountains, and so there were a lot of people who came to the task force because they were concerned about what was going on, and it wasn't just, you know, I don't want to see, you know, these holes in the forest. I mean, there were some horrible things that went on that weren't allowed, but they went on anyways, where streams were completely clear-cut, where, you know, landslides were falling in because of the type of logging. But people basically got involved and then got informed. So, and it was the informed comments at various hearings and things that, you know, we were able to shift things. You had it.
I hear good things about Bud McCrary and Big Creek Lumber and so on. Do you have a template for sustainable logging that you can get behind, or any kind of sympathy for doing it part way? Or would you rather be the spokesman for, you know?
Yeah,
Well-
I can add to that. We've talked a little bit about that 8,500 acre extension that was made public on their plans to do logging.
I don't get what you said,
So
Jim.
you remember in the Penny University when Gray Hayes was here, we talked a little bit about that 8,500 acre parcel of land from Cemex that was made public, and the intention to do a little logging on that.
Now, what about Big Creek? He's talking about Big Creek.
Well,
Well,
Yeah,
I
that's the
think
same
Jim's speaking to that idea. Is there a way that you could get behind and say, okay, let's log it, but let's do it this way, or,
well, there's two questions here, and if I just like deal with the question that is asked is, you know, what would you consider sustainable logging? And, you know, I think that, for me, it depends on, I mean, there are many levels, right? So I recently wrote an article on the microbiome of the forest. And I don't know if anybody saw, there was a study that the National Institutes of Health recently came out with a report on the study they did for 5 years, looking at what they call the microbiome of the human organism. So there's something like, and I'm really bad at remembering numbers, but
100 trillion
what's that?
bacteria.
Yeah, but it's like pounds.
Or like a petri
Like
dish.
most of the number of cells in our body, the majority of them are not human cells. They're bacteria and fungi and other things going on. And if you, because they're really small, if you compress it, it's somewhere like 5 pounds. So I mean, if you think about, you know, whatever, 5 pounds, I mean, your head's gotta weigh more than that, but is other than us. Well, they're all really important, and I know this is like a real weird way to answer your question, but there was one thing in this study that I thought was just incredibly fascinating, and obviously others did too, because it was part of the news story that came out, was they found that pregnant women have a particular microorganism in the birth canal that is not there ordinarily, that's in the gut, but is only in pregnant women, that helps with the digestion of milk. And so when babies are born, they are inoculated with these bacteria. Well, there are various kinds of studies that have been done in the forest. And there's a San Jose State student who did probably his doctoral thesis on spiders and other arthropods and these little critters that live in the duff, the litter on the forest floor. And he looked at old growth forests and second growth forests and plantation. And of course, completely different, and not just completely different, but what these microorganisms do, like they do stuff at night or they work in the daytime, is different in the different forests. And he said that what's really important is the bacteria. And I know I've read things, there's another guy, Paul Stamets, who is a fungi fanatic and brilliant, and he talks about the fact that you have certain, they call mycorrhiza in roots that can, in the forest floor, that determine that tree over there needs help, and so it sends this stuff, you know, rushing over to that tree, and sort of, you know, kind of like a good computer sends the stuff around. So from a certain perspective, you know, what is a healthy forest is a forest where we haven't managed it and mucked around in it. If you go from the perspective that, well, we need to do some of that, you know, what's reasonable, I would say that the rules and regulations we have in this area are a good start, but I think we should absolutely have a prohibition on cutting old growth trees, because we have no idea how important they may be to the whole ecosystem. There's another guy named Steve Sillett up at Humboldt University, Humboldt State, who has climbed these ancient redwoods and mapped out what's going on up there, and he's found salamanders that never reach the ground that live on the tops of these trees. He's found whole little mini ecosystems with ferns and huckleberries growing up on the limbs of these trees. He's found plankton in little pools of water up there, and you go, what in heaven's name is plankton doing up in that forest? So I mean, the natural system is so complex, and we know so little about it. I once saw a TV program about the Northwest forest that the majority of the nitrogen in the trees is of ocean origin. And you go, so how does that happen? And you think about these anadromous fish which live, you know, which are born in the streams. They grow there for a year or two. They migrate out into the ocean. They swim, we don't even know, but some I think swim across the oceans, and they come back to the stream where they were born, they migrate back up, they spawn there, and then they die. Well, now you've got all these carcasses, or you had when you had all the fish, and you've got bears, and you've got eagles, and you've got foxes, and you've got, and they're eating this, and then they're going off and pooping out in the forest. And so you've got this amazing system that's so complex that actually works. And we've changed so much of that. We don't have bears here. We don't have eagles. We don't have very many foxes, if foxes at all. It's been, probably 30 years since I've seen a fox. So, if you ask me in a forest, what would, logging, what would I want to see? I would want to see those old growth trees not touched at all. I would want to see an absolute no-cut riparian buffer zone, so that all the trees along that riparian area are left intact. You don't have log roads in there. You don't change things, because what happens now is we keep taking out the stream-side trees, and we have some protections for them, but I don't think enough, and they don't get large enough. And what happens, I can talk about stream ecology, but it's like sooner or later you have these large trees falling into the creek, and they back up, they back up some of the sediment that would flow down, and that's it's called, they meter the sediment. So you don't just have this huge, pulse, and the water doesn't come down in a huge flow, scouring the sides of the creek and causing even more sediment to come down. So what you end up is these trees they fall down, and they start to create pools behind them. They block some of the sediment, and then the water comes down and it swirls because it can't just get through these trees, and it forms a pool. And so there's like a little refugia for the fish. So when you do have a storm, there are fish in there, and they can hide under this log, and then you have microorganisms that are coming off the log that are providing food. So it's an incredibly beautiful, miraculous, intricate system. And when you have those pools, you're changing the level of the stream so that the underground water can flow in, and you've got cool water coming in and even more water entering the stream. So when we log along those riparian areas, and even though there are some rules that require certain trees to be left, it's like 16 inches or 18 inches or something is the size. An 18-inch tree is not going to provide the same long-term function in the stream as a 4-foot diameter tree. So that's, those are two things that I would like to see changed in our local rules. I feel compelled to just make one comment, because you brought up the name Big Creek, and they've got a brilliant PR factory. They not only used to have such a great relationship with the editor of the Sentinel, but when he retired, he was hired on as a PR person for the company. I don't know that he's still doing that. And while they may do better logging than some players, they happen to be the company that was proposing the 6-mile-long harvest in Los Gatos. And they have been the key players behind every piece of legislation. They were the ones who urged the legislature to change and take local control and give it to the state. They sued the county on the zoning issues. They have gone after the Fish and Game Commission, National Marine Fisheries Service, or NOAA, over trying to get the coho delisted. So, coho, we've got 2 anadromous fish species in our county. We've got steelhead trout that are born, and anadromy means they're born in the streams. They live part of their life cycle in the ocean, and then they come back and they spawn in the streams again. So we've got steelhead trout, we've got coho salmon. The coho are almost extinct. And you would hope, if they were almost extinct, that we would do as much as we possibly could to enable them to continue to live. I, for one, don't want the blood on my hands of allowing species to go extinct in my lifetime. And obviously not everybody feels that way. And, so they have been, very key players in attempting to claim that because the coho are in such dire straits, they weren't really native to this area, they can't really survive. And if they had been successful in any of their attempts to get them delisted, it would have allowed them to cut a few more trees along the riparian corridor.
And helicopter logging.
Sorry?
Helicopter logging that Big Creek was doing.
Yeah, I mean, lots of companies do helicopter logging if it, I mean, helicopter logging is one of those funny things because we're always told that it's more environmentally sound than other kinds of logging. And one, I guess it depends whether you're a golden eagle, or a fish. So it's not particularly great for birds that are nesting, and it's quote unquote better for fish in that you don't have to put roads in very steep areas. But if you didn't have the helicopters and you couldn't put the roads, we might not be logging in those areas, and so we might not be, running the risk of greater landslides or, some of the other issues that come along.
What's happening with the trust that bought all of the cement plant property? Have they come up with any kind of plans, or what's your sense about what's going to happen with that?
Well, they're waiting for this outside consultant to finish drawing up a management plan, or I don't even know if it's a management plan, but it's a plan to give them some kind of, take the community input, look at the resources on the property, look at the, the fact that you've got numerous streams, you've got Coho, you've got San Vicente Creek, which provides the water for the town of Davenport, but still has a Coho population, and there have been quite a number of restoration projects in the lower stream. There's some old growth out there. I mean, there are just a lot of different issues, and I know that the different organizations that have come together may not all be in agreement with what the end result or the end management should look like, and I know that there is a hope to open it to, some kind of recreation. At this point, it's kind of a crapshoot as to how things are gonna come out. But I know that, some land trusts really are all gung-ho for it to be a working forest. Others may have a little more reticence about that, but, nobody's saying much of anything until this plan comes out, and then they'll duke it out.
Your email this morning, one of your newsletters, talked about a new attack on old growth redwoods.
Oh, that's up in Tahoe.
Yeah.
That wasn't redwoods, but that's old growth up in Tahoe, I think.
Yeah, tell us about that. I didn't read it.
I read it really quickly, Bruce. It struck me as one of the more bizarre things that I've read in a long time.
Old growth what then? Sequoia? What?
I didn't even read it. I think it might be pine, but there's some areas in the Tahoe Basin where you've still got some of these, 400, 250, 400 or older trees, and the aspen population along the streams has been in decline for a variety of reasons. And again, I can't speak in depth because it's not an area that I've paid much attention to, but they've now decided that they need to work on replenishing the aspens. And the little that I did see in that, there was a discussion that, because of the fire, prohibiting fire, and because of clear cutting that or logging that took place and stuff that happened in the last 100 years, we've seen this decline in aspens. Because that's right, it was firs or something else have grown up because we've stopped fire from going through there. So these other conifers have grown up and they're shading out the aspens. And a fellow named Chad Hansen, who is with the John Muir Project and is very much a proponent of the importance of fire in the landscape, was saying, I don't know if he was the one who was saying, but he was quoted a number of times in this article, and somebody was saying that, if you want to help the aspens, then take out the trees that have grown up in the last 100 years because we haven't allowed fire in there, not the trees that have been there for the last 500 or 400 or 500 years, because clearly the aspen were able to grow even when those trees are there, So it's a little bit of what I call the madness of the human mind, where we are so intent on doing things for better or for worse, or doing things to help, or doing things to make money, whatever the intention, but we know so little. The more we know, well, there's still so much that we don't know, that it's hard to make sure that we are not creating a bigger problem in an attempt to rectify something. And just to give you an example of that, probably 20 years ago, I went to a workshop on fire up at UC Davis. And You know, we used to do these controlled burns, and we do them in the springtime when there was a lot of residual moisture, so the things wouldn't get out of control. And I mean, that made sense, right? You're not gonna wanna burn people's houses down. Well, what they found out was that there was so much moisture that seeds were getting steamed. And seeds that, if a fire came through in, you know, September, October, would have been released. And there are a lot of seeds that actually, I don't know about a lot, there's some seeds where the seed casing doesn't even open without fire. These would get released, and then, you know, the fire provides this wood ash, which I used to be an organic farmer, and so we would add wood ash to the soil because it's high in potassium and I don't know what else, I don't remember the
All
stuff.
kinds of minerals.
Yeah, potash and stuff. So it's really, really important for fertilizing the soil. So now you'd have this additional fertilizer, the heat would have opened up these seeds, and then you get germination and, you know, replenishment and regrowth and that stuff. Well, by doing these controlled burns in the spring, what we're finding out was we're actually steaming the seeds so that they became unviable, or, you know, they were worthless. So sometimes we learn from our mistakes. Sometimes we don't do such a good job learning from our mistakes. And sometimes the profit motive is so strong. I can imagine, I don't know this for a fact, but this was like a Forest Service project. I can imagine that somebody decided the only way they could afford to do this thinning project for the aspens was to take out enough of the large trees to pay for the project. Because I know through CAL FIRE and the state, on state private lands, exactly that same thing happened. It was like CAL FIRE was a few years ago, was trying to come up with an exemption process where timber landowners could go in and clean up some of the mess they'd created, where, you know, they would do this logging. I saw it in the Sierras, you got a lot of pine, where what grows back is a thicket of small trees. There's just a fire disaster waiting to happen. So they wanted to be able to go in and do some thinning and use these major machines that are masticators. They chip everything up, they just compress the soil, whatever. But they don't want to have to pay for it. So they wanted to cut larger trees. And initially the CAL FIRE fire guys said, well, wait a minute. Those trees are the ones that you want to be growing for, because the bigger trees don't burn the same way. You might get a little fire inside, creates a cavity, but they're the ones that stay. It's the small ones that just disintegrate. And the timber guys won out in the end that they could cut X number of trees to pay for these projects. So I'm guessing that's what's going on up there. And even then they said they were still going to lose money on it.
Yeah, I have a question about something that I've observed in city politics, which is that it seems like the powers that be who are pushing kind of a repressive agenda toward the homeless people in town will tend to use an ecological rhetoric to kind of bolster their case. The big fight that's going on over people camping around along the river levee and saying that nobody can go down by the river at all, basically because it's a biological restoration zone. And it seems kind of, to me, kind of reflective of what I've witnessed with the environmental movement is that it's a broad generalization, but it does tend to be led by upper middle class people. And I guess to get to a question in all this, I'm wondering if you've had any kind of experience with that dynamic or any insight into it from your experience as an activist.
Take these questions, you're all kind of like, so I'll try and answer a couple parts of that. One is, from the river's perspective, having people, and from the ocean's perspective, having people living on the banks or in the channel of the river basically is not great from an environmental point of view. We've got trash, plastic that ends up out in the ocean, and you know, one of my other things is whales. And I can tell you, you know, the amount of plastic that goes out there is, well, it's actually, whales have a problem with ships and entanglement, but you know, plastic's not a good thing, okay? There are a lot of reasons why it's not good to have homeless encampments along the river. but it shouldn't be an either or. We should find an alternative way to deal with the homeless population by preventing it from happening in the first place, by figuring out, how to, I mean, you can't just let people, you can't just say, well, it's shut down, go someplace else. I mean, it's a huge problem, and to me, the issue is the lack of social creativity, or lack of creativity in the social realm, and to just say, well, it's okay for them to go live down by the river. One of the things that happens in Watsonville, because I'm on the county's Fish and Game Advisory Commission, so we get some stuff there, is that we have lower income people, going to fish along the river and using nets and putting nets up across the, river. So I'm going to say one of our problems is there's so many of us on this planet, and we, in Western culture, we have a way of, we're still living in the Wild West, that there's plenty, there's abundance, and we can just use everything, and we don't need it, we just toss it out. So that's a problem that ricochets down to all levels. As far as the environmental movement being, I was going to say the other thing that, there's like people dump trash in the rivers more so in the South County than they do here. And one of our commissioners used to go out, and his own personal thing was just go out there and pick up the television sets and all the stuff that was junked out there, and try and get donations so he could get it to the dump without having to pay dump fees out of his own pocket. But we happen to live in a community where the real, only real industry is logging. We don't have refineries. We don't have, chemical manufacturing plants. We don't have paper mills. We don't have a lot of pollutants. And in certain cities, you get a lot of that, and it's they tend to be in the communities with poorer populations. And so you do, in some of those areas, get these kind of social justice things. But my experience and my understanding of it is that most poor people don't have the luxury of taking the time to try and deal with the environment, even if it's killing them. Totally. They're just trying to figure out how to pay for their food, their rent, their transportation, and just bloody well survive.
Cancer medication.
What was that? What did I leave out? Medication?
Cancer medication.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's and I would also say that from the standpoint of being in the middle class, I feel like I have a responsibility, and I have a privilege of being able to, do something. Now, I do it as my, I can hardly say I make my living. I get paid to do what I do now, but I didn't for many years. I did it because I grew up in a family with an ethic that that's what you did. I happened to grow up in the Los Angeles area, and I remember thinking, how can you possibly influence, a city of how many millions of people? Now, I find myself working in Sacramento, and it's tough. I mean, the political realities are really hard. And to go back to your question, it takes people, and there's some quote, I'm not good at those quotes, but it's like Margaret Mead or something, but it's like, what can one person do? And it's like only one person, I mean, that's the only thing that can make change. I butchered that, didn't I? But anyways, we've been trying to work with Secretary Laird on this clear-cut issue, and one of the things that we were told way back in the beginning is, the community needs to, public needs to speak out. And some of the things that happened with the XL pipeline and the fact that it just didn't run through is because hundreds of thousands of people said, not gonna happen. That's the only reason that it hasn't actually gotten approval at this point in time. And, all I can say is the more we can care and the more we can do something, as much as each of us can do. And, for some people it's more than others. For some it may just be, clicking on some petitions online, and for others it may be, going to meetings and speaking your mind. And what I have found is that people usually get started as NIMBYs, not in my backyard. And I don't see anything wrong with that. I see that as completely reasonable, because that's the most obvious connection. I did hear somebody who is at the who works for the Board of Forestry, make a comment the other day as a forester that he was very upset because one of his clients, when he was in the private sector, you know, doing timber harvest plans, one of his clients had to wait 30 days on that plan because somebody commented from out of state. And, you know, my response was, I hope you're not trying to tell me that I shouldn't be allowed to have an opinion and comment on mountaintop removal mining, you know, because it's taking place on the East Coast. I mean, I think that, you know, that is supposed to be what this country was built on, is that, you know, we have freedom of speech, and I think we should care about everything. I mean, I think it's good to not be hypocritical, but sometimes that's hard. So,
You want to talk about the recent changes in the Sierra Club?
no,
Okay.
What happened?
that was easy.
What are they?
Doesn't want to talk about it.
Anybody else have a question?
I had a question.
Yeah, because I've got more I can talk about, but I want to,
Okay.
questions, yes.
In 10 seconds, are you for desalinization or not?
Personally,
Stop it.
and I'm not speaking for anybody else but me, I have serious problems with desal because of my concerns about the ocean.
Yes,
And,
yes.
you know, somebody once said something about having, you know, if you were gonna have a desal plant, you should have a salt manufacturer right alongside it. So
Yeah.
you can actually
Use
be
it.
taking that salt and utilizing it for something. You know, and I know, but you know, then there's a whole issue of screens and all the kind of, you know, micro life that can get entrained in and stuff like that. I just think we need to be smarter. And one of the other concerns I have with desal is then we have this abundant, endless supply of water. You know, how do we make sure that we don't end up increasing our population based on that, you know, that endless supply of water? So there are a number of,
Well, I don't think you have to worry about that because it's very expensive.
I don't know. We've done, you know, the governor just approved this Delta Tunnel thing, which is very expensive, which is more insane, you
Yeah,
know.
but it's energy intensive too.
Yeah, it is, it's energy intensive, and there are a lot of things. I haven't studied it in depth, but, you know, what I do know, and, you know, we're still doing things with water that are pretty insane, but they're so commonplace. I mean, taking the fresh water and flushing your waste down the toilet with it is nuts. You know, it's absolutely nuts. But it's what we've done for so long because we didn't have to think of an alternative, and because, you know, an alternative requires more initial input, initial this, that, and the other thing. But the whole idea that you can have a community, you know, cities that aren't somehow recycling wastewater and having a system whereby that could be used to flush toilets, assuming that we think flush toilets are necessary, you know, it just,
Scotts Valley's working on that.
who is?
Scotts Valley, they have their blue system, their blue pipe system
Yeah,
for a lot of the public buildings and things where they're starting to separate that out, and so there's some progress somewhere.
I was gonna, just one thing I was gonna say, also awareness in terms of what you can do. I mean, I swim at the Simpkins Center pool, and, you know, yes, they have the shower thing where you have to push the button and, you know, water comes out for a minute and then you have to push it again. But nowhere in there is there a sign that says, you're sharing this water with the fish. You know, be conscious, just be aware of how much you actually use. And, you know, there are little kids in there who shower, and sometimes they're just in there and they keep pushing the button, but even adults. I mean, so many people just have no idea where things come from and the interconnectedness.
On that very point, perhaps Santa Cruz should say, we're in a planet that's already overpolluted, that's already over-extracting, overpopulated and over-poisoning the planet. Let's recognize that reality, and Santa Cruz County set that example with the Sierra Club's endorsement. I would hope we won't have any more growth. We'll have only sustainable housing built, we'll have only sustainable plumbing, and we will demonstrate that for the country and the planet. How about that as a mission statement for the new Santa Cruz County?
Well, that was kind of the mission statement of the old Santa Cruz, and I would love to see it come back, but I, you know,
We got it right.
yeah.
That made the rents go up
Well-
so high. That made the rents go up so
2
high.
minutes.
Wolf. Yeah, okay, Wolfgang, you want to give a report?
We collected $81,
Yay!
which is nice, but not enough. So I may have to hit you up again next week or the week after.
Okay, well, let's thank Jodi Frediani for coming and giving us all of that, but not the Sierra Club. No, and next week, in one sense, we'll be continuing this discussion because Gray Hayes is coming back,
Oh,
one
good.
of our loyal members, and so he will be also talking probably more, Terry, about
Okay.
politics and environment.
Excuse me, before we go, Bruce, can we have Ed give a report?
Let me finish, and then after Gray Hayes, Dennis Etler will be here, and he will be talking, he emailed me and said he'd rather talk more about what's happening in China than secular humanism. And then on September 3rd, Becky O'Malley, as I mentioned last week, who is Mary Holmes' daughter-in-law, she will be here. And then Paul Lee comes back.
Dennis told me personally just last Friday that he's gonna talk about recent developments in human evolution when he's here on the 27th.
Oh, that's right.
That
And
he
human-
thought that we would be really interested in,
Yes.
I
You're
totally
right,
agree.
you're right. You would-
That he happens to be up on all that, and there's been quite some developments, and we're gonna hear all about it 2 weeks from today.
Yep, perfect, okay. A report?
I'd like to ask Jodi a quick question. Do you have any recommendations for the election?
That's a good question.
The tough one.
Which level are we talking about?
Well, the local. Board of
Well,
Supervisors.
I don't live in the city, so I don't pay close attention to that. But I think that, given where the funding has come from and other things, I think that Eric Hammer in the Valley is more likely going to
Yeah.
follow in the shoes of, the predecessors in the Valley than Mr. McPherson. I mean, anybody who suddenly denounces his Republican membership at this point in time in election makes me wonder, where his values actually lie. I mean, if he can do that, what else
Where
can he
was
do?
it when we really needed it?
So,
Thank you.
He's a-
thank you for inviting me. Thank you for
That ends the report.